Well, I'm not sure if you picked up on it or not during this morning's reading, but Genesis 21 really is the quintessential happy ending to the story of Abraham and his wife Sarah as it relates to the arrival of the promised son, Isaac. This is the point of the story of Abraham and Sarah thus far, where Genesis reaches one of those triumphant crescendos. This is a very big moment, and hopefully we can give service to that moment and to the importance that this text actually is. I mean, God's people in this early stage of our history have cause to rejoice, to celebrate, to laugh, and to throw a party, as we see. The birth of Isaac in this chapter truly is good news. And it's good news in a way that the arrival of a promised son always should be good news. God's promised seed, foretold all the way back in the garden to the woman when he told the woman that she would have an offspring who would crush the head of the serpent. That promise endures, and we see the delivery of a child of promise here in our passage. In many ways, this text, especially that first part, the first section, this is absolutely a comedy. Now, not in the slapstick way of comedy or the way in which we think about stand-up comics, but this is a comedy in that older literary sense. This is a story that ends in a triumph. This is absolutely, as mentioned, a happy ending. The exaltation and the joy of the main characters is how this story comes to its conclusion. All comedies, whether you're thinking of literature or you think of plays or film, all comedies end in the type of festivity, celebration, oftentimes a wedding, not here, but a wedding, some sort of cause for feast and celebration. The story is the climactic coming of a son. And so as we think about that, and we think about our own, even the events or the time of season we're heading into as God's people, as we think about the arrival of a son, of a seed, of an offspring, after long expectation, is really where we want to focus our attention on as we consider Genesis chapter 21 here today. We consider this good news and the hope that in this story that this son gave to Abraham and Sarah, and also consider for us the hope that God's Son delivers to humanity and his people. We're going to cover this section under three headings this morning, as is our practice. And the first of which is this point number one: the divine comedy. The divine comedy. Now, I do have to do a little bit of work to catch us up. As a church, we've been preaching through the book of Genesis. We made it all the way here to chapter 21. It's been a blast, but there's a lot of things that we need to know to understand what's happening. In chapter 21, Abraham and his family is now in the southern part of the land of Canaan, or what will become Israel, in this region called the Negev. And they're particularly in this land that belongs to this King Abimelech. In chapter 20, Abraham traveled south from where he was at before, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham and his whole household go south, and then he's encountered by Abimelech, and back in that chapter, in verse 15, sort of the conclusion and the main point of that entire interaction between Abraham and the king was that Abraham was provided a safe and a stable land to dwell in. The king tells Abraham back in that chapter in verse 15, "Behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you." And that really was the point that we saw. Abraham has been wandering for many years. Here, we're told he's at the ripe old age of 100. In the span of his life, he's sojourned from the Far East into the land of Canaan. He's had to leave Canaan and travel south to go down into Egypt because of a famine, and he escaped Egypt after God brought judgment upon the Pharaoh with various plagues. Abraham's also separated from Lot. He's rescued Lot through warfare. He's rescued Lot again from the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he spent a lot of time in this one particular region, but now he's journeyed south again, entered into his truce, into this truce with the king Abimelech. And all that wandering, now he's at 100 years old. He's still out wandering. Hopefully I'm in decent shape by 100 where I can take a road trip here or there or be out walking. Through all that time, Abraham has been wandering because of one simple thing, that God came to him, God promised him that he would make him a great nation, and to his offspring, his promised seed, a particular son and his son's children, God promised Abraham that he would give his offspring a land. And so the story of his life has been geared around the expectation and the arrival of this son of promise. And there have been different false starts and different things have happened. All sorts of complications have arisen. But through everything, God has been there to repeatedly assure to him that his promises will stand firm. God makes a covenant with Abraham, a covenant that he keeps expanding, he keeps giving details. We see things like God walked through the pieces, circumcisions given to Abraham. Abraham's faith is reckoned to him as righteousness, and it's his faith that becomes the foundation for his standing in this covenant, which is based on grace. And Abraham, along the way, has also made some mistakes. He fathered a natural son, Ishmael, but God preserves Ishmael, and God delivers Hagar and promises that hey, even though his purposes won't be carried out through Ishmael, God will still bless him and make a nation of him. And all of this has been happening in the background for several chapters now, until we get to 21 verses 1 through 7, when the long-awaited delivery of this heir, of this son Isaac, takes place. And all that was foretold came to pass. God opens the womb of Sarah. She conceives a son born to Abraham. They're very excited parents. You can tell they're treated like first-time parents in the text, or like parents of like only children. If you are an only child here, sorry, I can't relate. But they are overwhelmingly joyful about this son in particular. I mean, Abraham names his son Isaac just as God said, circumcises him on the 8th day, and the text says, and Sarah in verse 6 is just overwhelmed. God has made laughter for me, she said. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. It's a comedy. It's a joyful, happy ending. It's unbelievable to these older people that God has come through for them, that they've received this child for them to dote on, and this child that carries the hope for their future and all the ways in which God has promised to bless them. It is fitting, though, that what we see over and over once the son comes is just laughter, overwhelming laughter. I mean, his son Isaac means laughter. They all laugh. They talk about people laughing. It is over the top, and it's hard for us to relate, to just see how sort of ridiculous and over the top and joyful this actually thing, this thing is. But this is very much, again, in the fashion of those comedies that have an overwhelming happy ending. And the only thing that I can relate to this that I can draw from that is similar to this is like from Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's comedies, in particular, something like Much Ado About Nothing, it's like an overwhelming sense of joy and exaltation and just happiness, laughter that takes place at the end of that play. If you're unfamiliar, that comedy ends with two prospective weddings. All the schemes of evildoers are uncovered. A maiden who was presumed dead is actually alive and shows up, as it were, sort of at the altar, as it were, about to get married. It's all this sadness turned to joy. And if you've never seen that play or read the play, one of the absolute most over the top version is this 1993 version directed by Kenneth Branagh of Much Ado About Nothing. I do recommend it, but that ending is so over the top. My wife is laughing because I watch it with her and just kind of roll my eyes at how cheesy it is. Just the end is just this prolonged single shot where there are people dancing, and it's so happy. I can't imagine anyone being that happy. Until you read this, where these folks, they just cannot believe what God has done in giving them this son. I mean, this is, quite frankly, what we should feel when we reflect on the arrival of Christ, when we have, Christmas coming up and that season. And there's absolutely undertones of what they're experiencing is that, they're proclaiming, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. That's what's happening in this particular story. So if we're reading this whole chapter as the conclusion, in a way, to Abraham and Sarah's story, this is the climax, right? This is the crescendo, this particular event. But, any good story doesn't just end with the climax. A good ending also requires some resolution. You have to wrap up some of the loose ends and give a little bit of information on what comes next. It's like when you're in the movie theater for the first time, at least I was. Some of you guys are so young, you weren't in the movie theaters when The Return of the King came out, and the ring gets cast into the fire, and you think, awesome, it's over. And then there's like 30, 45 minutes left of movie, which Jack Nicholson famously met Elijah Wood and told him that he left the theater because there were too many endings. The rest of the story, though, of chapter 21 this is like additional 25 minutes after the ending just to wrap up the story. That really is what the rest of this is. It is a resolution that relates to the arrival of Isaac and the tying up of loose ends. So we're just going to go through them in order. So the second point here this morning is point number 2. Resolution 1 as it relates to Ishmael. So resolution 1. In verses 8 through 21, we hear about what happens to Ishmael and his mother Hagar. Now, this again is the son who was displaced as chosen heir. Well, he was never actually given that status to begin with. But this is the son that Abraham fathered from Hagar before Sarah bore Isaac. And if you recall, that was an ugly situation, and it was where Sarah and Abraham schemed along with the slave woman, and the old wounds that were there from that first story are very hard to heal. And we see some of those contentions arise again in verse 8. It says, beginning in verse 8, Abraham and Sarah throw this party. Now, the reason why I say that they're kind of like parents of an only child, or this is their first kid and they're just like really excited, it's because they're just celebrating everything. Like they're throwing a feast, not because it's his birthday or even because he was circumcised. They're throwing a feast because he was weaned. So like they're just finding any excuse to dote on their kid. Like they're really excited. Like if this was the first kid in their camera roll, there'd be like tons of pictures of the first child, and then like less in the second, and then like in my family's case, when we get to the 4 kids, it's like, man, when I look at the number of pictures I have for my first, not because I love the first more, but we were just excited about everything the first kid did. And that's very much what's happening here. They're throwing this party, they're excited, but Hagar and her son Ishmael are there, and Sarah sees the boy Ishmael, who's Isaac's half-brother, laughing. And very clearly, he is laughing, and it's interpreted in the New Testament, as we read, that he's laughing in a way that he's mocking Isaac. He's teasing him. Well, Sarah, the mama bear, she sees her son being made fun of, and that's just going to set off anybody. If you see your kid getting picked on, you're gonna say something about it. And so with that, this bitterness arises. She goes to Abraham and she asks him to cast out both the child and the slave woman, because now that Abraham has a son of promise, a true heir, they should not be here any longer. Well, Abraham is reluctant. This is, after all, this kid according to the flesh, his natural-born son. But what happens next is not a straight repeat of what happened before. God approves of sending Hagar and Ishmael away. He says that the time has come. It's okay. God reaffirms that his promises is going to be delivered through Isaac, not Ishmael. And so Ishmael is sent away. But he's sent away with the blessing as well. I mean, God affirms once again that Ishmael will be the father himself of a nation. He will be made into a nation. And this is, as I mentioned in previous speeches, this is one of the things that I think a lot of the interpretations that we're familiar with are not, they don't address or cover, is that there are lots of Abrahamic people in the Old Testament. That there are people like we learn from Lot, and then his children are going to be regarded as Abrahamic people. There's Ishmael here. There's going to be Esau as well. There's lots of other groups of people that also occupy the land of Canaan, that in one sense, the promise to Abraham that he will father many nations does come true in its very clearly by the time we get to Joshua, because there are lots of these nations that are part of God's plan, not for salvific plans, not according to promise. I'm not saying that they are Israel, but there's a way in which there is this limited fulfillment that takes place in the history of the Old Testament. And we see the beginnings of that here. Hagar and Ishmael are sent out. They're given supplies of food and water. They make their way south to the area of Beersheba. While wandering, when it looks like things are getting dire, like they're about to die from thirst, and Hagar she can't bear the sight of her son passing away, the Lord reveals himself to her and answers their calls. God opened her eyes, it says in verse 19. And she sees there what will give her life, a well for water. When she fills the skin of water, God blesses her, reaffirms that this son will endure, is going to be the father of many nations, and she even goes so far as to give him a wife. And so even though it seems like the circumstances are harsh, even though it's hard to parse in many ways how this story should be interpreted, we are once again dealing with a comedy and a happy ending. Ishmael is made a nation. He's made the father of a great people. The Lord reveals himself to Hagar once again and sustains them and provides for them. They're given earthly blessings. And him being called a man of the wilderness, this is a good thing, because at this point in Genesis, cities and technology is looked down upon at this point. When you're drawn towards the city, when you're drawn towards technology like Lot, bad things happen. You get judged. He is blessed. But his blessing is different. It's earthbound. Well, the second thing, that's the first resolution, and it is a good turn of events for Ishmael and Hagar according to their lot. The second resolution, and point number 3, is simply the resolution 2 with Isaac. This story, the way this chapter ends, is kind of strange. You get these details about Abraham comes into an agreement with this guy. Philistines are mentioned. There's a well again. They do covenants, and it seems like it comes out of nowhere. It's like, why is this here? How can this be wrapped into the coming of Isaac? Well, this is very clearly this passage. This is like a postscript. This is just a note that you tag along to the end of the climax to just tell people what's happening. It's part of the resolutions. I think about like any biopic that you watch after the conclusion of the story. And in most biopics, what happens? I mean, there's some, if it's an artist, if it's a music artist, they'll like have some success, lose everything, go live a life really rough, and then be redeemed in the end. And then at the end, you get these like postscripts or these cards that note, oh, this person went on to live till they were 92, and they went off and had this many children. Well, that's kind of what the story is. This just gives us details and information about what happened to Isaac after he was born, how was he made safe, where did he live, and it's just the last little bit of information. And that's what's here. So describing this then is very simple. Abimelech is back. He was from the previous chapter. He's the king who rules in the south where Abraham is staying, and he comes with this army officer, this guy named Phicol. Now Abimelech comes to Abraham. He reminds Abraham that they made this treaty. There's this peace agreement. He gave Abraham this place where he can sojourn safely, where he can hang out, where he can set up his tents, and where he can encamp. And so what they do is they just talk just to make sure that they can reaffirm that everything's all good. Abraham's safe. He's still okay to dwell there, and there's no problems. In verse 22, he says to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear by me here, by your God, that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me, and with the land in which you have sojourned. And then Abraham surprisingly does swear. So what is the point of that? Well, remember, Abraham's household is huge. It is extremely large, and they're fairly new in this region. They haven't spent time in this area in the south before. So if you're the king and you have this huge traveling party enter into your territory, it might make you a little bit nervous. Previously, he took Sarah's wife. He gave her back. They reached this tentative agreement, this peace. Abraham prayed for him, but now Abraham has a son. What does a son mean potentially then for Abimelech? A son means potentially, a new threat, an heir. Like, what is this guy going to do? Like, what is Abraham going to do? Is he going to be opposed to me, or is my kingdom going to be safe from him? And so that's why, if you read carefully, he wants to make sure that Abraham will not deal falsely with him in verse 23, with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. He just wants to make sure from Abraham that this peace they have, that it's going to be multi-generational, that they're going to be under the same terms as they go on, that Abraham, because of his size, is not going to try and take over that land. That's what this whole section is about. And so what Abraham is doing in this little episode is he's recommitting and reaffirming his commitment to being a sojourner, a wanderer, to taking up temporary residence in that area, that he's not coming to settle that land. He's not coming to found a city or to go to war against Abimelech. That's also likely why Abimelech brought a military commander with him, right? Just in case. That was like, he brought some backup in case something went down. He's doing this deal with Abraham. He needs to make sure that, that if things go south, he has a tough guy with him who can make sure, that he's safe and nothing bad happens. I remember one time I was going to buy a dog in Rubidoux, which if you don't know much about the Inland Empire, that's not like the best part of town. It's pretty rough. So I'm going to buy this dog in Rubidoux. I know nothing about these people, so I had to call for backup to take someone with me when I went to this strange house. Now the guy that I ended up taking with me, his name is Chris Calvi. He's all 5'5" and like 140 pounds soaking wet. So he wasn't exactly intimidating, but it made me feel safer that I had some backup when I went to negotiate. That's what's happening more or less here. They're just trying to come to an agreement. And obviously, as we saw, Abraham agrees. Everything is chill, everything's good, but with just one small caveat. There's this well that they have a dispute over, this well in this place called Beersheba, or what will be called Beersheba. Now, apparently Abraham thought that he had rights to this well because it's probably the well that appeared for the sake of Hagar, because that was the same exact area that we read previously that Hagar was spared by the Lord. And so Abraham believes he has a right to this. He tells Abimelech that it was unjustly seized by some of his men. But Abimelech pleads innocent. He doesn't know anything about it. He agrees with Abraham that, no, you can have the well. That's not a problem. It's a small price to pay for the safety of my kingdom. And so they come to an agreement. Verse 27 says that Abraham takes sheep and oxen and gives them to Abimelech, and that the two men there, they enter into a covenant. So they enter into a contract or an agreement. Verse 28 and 29, it's kind of funny. Then Abraham does something like strange. Like he takes these 7 ewe lambs, gives them to them. And what's funny is that Abimelech doesn't even know why he does that. In verse 29, he says, what is the meaning of this? Like he's not familiar. Can you imagine? He just starts setting aside things. He doesn't know the ritual. He doesn't get it. And the only reason for that being stated there is because that just gives the place its name, Beersheba. And then it says that Abimelech and Phicol return to the land of the Philistines. Now, don't be confused. If you've read this and you're like, what the heck? Why are we talking about the Philistines now, out of nowhere? This was written, this is a bit of an anachronism. We've seen these come up in Genesis before, where there were no Philistines at all in the land during the time of Abraham's life. But upon the time of writing of this book, during the time of Moses, that land would have been known as the land of the Philistines. It's by the coast. So it's just trying to describe the territory. It's not saying that Philistines lived there, right? It's, I've used this example before. It's like me saying, thousands of years ago, there were people who passed through Long Beach. Well, thousands of years ago, it wasn't called Long Beach, but if someone happened to pass through there, it's helpful for us to use that term because we know geographically where it is. So for here, it's not saying that the Philistines were there. It's just saying that these guys, Abimelech and his officer Phicol, they went back to the coast, which they knew upon writing was the land of the Philistines. Where we're left, though, is Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah now in Beersheba. This is the place where Hagar and Ishmael first fled, where God appeared to them and spared them by making a well appear. It's the same place. And Beersheba will now become one of the central locations as we continue through Genesis and we consider the life of the patriarchs. It will become significant. And there have been a few of these, right? When Abraham came Abraham for chapters and chapters was hanging out by this oak of Mamre. This is another landmark, just another place. But what's important is here in verse 33 as we come to a close. Abraham plants a tree in Beersheba, and it's there that he calls upon the name of the Lord. Now, when you see that phrase, especially in Genesis, time of the patriarchs, when someone calls upon the name of the Lord, it doesn't just mean that they were in their shower praying or just casually talking and calling upon God's name. No, it means that he set up an altar and he formally and properly worshiped God in this place. That he turned this place by making an altar into a holy site. He called upon the name of the Lord in the same way he did at Bethel, the same way he did at the Oak of Mamre, and now here at this place, Beersheba. And so what that signifies is that Abraham is now making this place his home. That this is where they're going to be for a while. They've set up an altar. This is where they will offer sacrifices to God to worship him and to praise him. And they're going to stick around. And as we see Isaac and his life unfold, we will see that that is the case. But again, this is just part of that resolution that I mentioned. The resolution is this, that just as God made provision and saved Ishmael and Hagar in the desert and gave and gave them water and sent them and turned him into a great nation, just as God did that for him, God also has provided for Isaac. God's promised offspring now has been made safe and secure. He has an earthly place to dwell for a while. Abraham has settled, and he's found a place where he and Sarah and their newborn son can rest. They've been granted a bit of respite and security in the land, and all the turmoil of life, at least for a time, has been set at ease. Abraham is granted a small glimpse of rest, of happiness, overwhelming joy, laughter in the arrival of his son, and all of his labors, all of the work that he's done for his life, wandering and journeying and fighting wars and doing all sorts of stuff. All of his labors have come to a conclusion. God has blessed him with a son, and his labor has now culminated in a time of worship and of rest. And just as God labored for 6 days and then rested on the seventh, so Abraham's life has followed the same pattern, where he's worked, he's labored, God has granted reward, and now he's given a little bit of a reprieve. This is Abraham's happy ending. And that story is, frankly, the story of our Christian life as well, because the similarities of the way in which God grants rest to his people through the delivery and through the giving of a promised son is one that's repeated in the scriptures over and over and over until it culminates in the arrival of Jesus Christ. Abraham's salvation and joy is in the delivery of the Son, as our salvation and joy, our redemption, all of our hopes, our cause for rejoicing, our lives are a comedy where we rejoice in the arrival of God's only Son. The great hope that we have in Christ is the undoing of all the wrongs in the world, that he wipes away every tear, that he makes all wrongs right, that he brings justice and peace. And our Christian life in Christ is a large comedy that will culminate in a great celebration, a wedding feast, the wedding feast to end all wedding feasts. But like Abraham, or similar to Abraham, we have a prolonged time of waiting, trusting in God to deliver the end of all things in his own timing. And yet we have much more cause for hope and for faith even than Abraham, because Christ has come. He has come once to offer up his own life as a sacrifice for us. He has accomplished a victory truly and really and completely upon the cross. And all that is left is for that victory to be consummated, for that victory to be openly and clearly publicly declared, and for Christ to judge all things. May we as God's people endure in this between time, and may we begin our celebration and our participation in the laughter of the comedy of existence. May we begin that process even now in our worship as a church and in our lives and our homes before his face every day. Let's pray.